So I'm really excited about the salt of the earth thing. That's going to be great. So I really enjoyed that. Like I said, I learned a lot, and I had no idea what characters are about. So anyway, all right. So we're going to start a series starting today on the wilderness, and it was I'll tell you kind of its roots. Its roots began when I was studying for Christmas, and we were looking at worship and through the eyes of the angels and the shepherds and the wise men. And I kept reading beyond, Christ's birth and into the next 3 or 4 chapters. And one of the things I noticed is that there's a series of wilderness events that happen afterwards. And so I started thinking a lot about the importance of the wilderness, not just as a theme, but as an event throughout the entire Bible. And so we are going to take a look at the wilderness events throughout the Bible and talk about how they are for us today and deal with it. So when I say the word wilderness, most of you, what do you think?
Trials.
Huh?
Trials.
Trials. Richard would also think
Bears.
Bears, right? Wouldn't everybody think of bears? I think of bears all the time. Even though I'm a Braves fan now.
Mountain lions.
Mountain lions? You said mountain lions. Mountain lions, that's a good one. Especially if you're in Northern California. All right, stop. Being from California, a lot of us, this is probably, if you're from California, a lot of us probably have this kind of an image of wilderness. And so we read the word wilderness in the Bible, we think of this sort of isolated location. I often like to think of evergreens, because I think that's the way God designed the wilderness. But if you think of the wilderness in the Old Testament, this is what it's talking about. This is the wilderness the Israelites wandered in. You can tell why they got lost.
Oh, yeah.
Right? This is the wilderness. This is what it looked like. This is the biblical wilderness. So as we talk about wilderness over the next few weeks, I want you to, we'll use this photo every week, but I want you to keep in mind this concept of what the Bible's talking about when it talks about the wilderness. We like this idea of really prettiness and fantastic greatness in Yosemite. But this is where the children of Israel tended to wander. Now you can see why a land flowing with milk and honey and giant grapes and everything would be so appealing after walking in that. Right? I mean, you're looking for milk and honey and grapes, right? Because you're not going to find anything out there. And so I began to ask myself the question, why would someone enter the wilderness? Okay, first of all, it looks like that. You really got to ask yourself that question, right? I was in Australia a few years ago, and I remember they were talking about this wilderness called the Blue Mountains. And they're called the Blue Mountains, and they're sorry, backwards. So they're west of Sydney. And I remember thinking, they're called, why would they call them Blue Mountains? Well, from a distance, they look blue. And then every mountain looks the same. The closer you get, they're repetitive. And so these great explorers, mostly French, would go in there and get lost. And they would never be heard of again. Because they were convinced they could go in there and sort of map out this region, and they would go in and struggle. Because the repetitive nature of the mountains would cause a lot of confusion. And so they would end up getting lost and never heard of them again. And so when I think of wilderness, I always think to myself, why would somebody enter something like that? Well, you can think of a lot of different reasons, right? Adventure, that's a good one. Escape, also a good one. Insanity, that makes sense. Confusion, isolation, curiosity, right? I mean, maybe you guys come up with some other ideas in your head about why you'd enter a wilderness, but escape can have a couple of levels. One, it can be the escape to an isolation. You got a lot of people that just want to be alone, so I'm going to go up into this place because no one would ever dare follow me in. The other thing would be to escape from an enemy. It's a good place to run into is the wilderness because it's a little hard to track. So there's a lot of reasons that one would enter the wilderness. And so those are some of the things that we'll be talking about. Nowhere in the Bible do we see greater provision and tension between God and his people than we do in the wilderness. As you read about the wilderness events throughout the Bible, you see a lot of tension and provision. It's okay to say the word tension. A lot of people, when they hear the word tension, they tend to go, oh, no. But there is tension. And if you don't believe me, go read, Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, and tell me that God doesn't have tension with people. When his responses are things like, you're kidding, right? Okay, that's tension. Are you complaining again? That's tension. Now, I know a lot of us go, no, God doesn't feel tension. Well, God does get a little bit annoyed. And that's evidenced throughout most of the Old Testament. Luckily, because of Jesus, God is no longer ever annoyed with us. And so, the same thing we would say is nowhere in our lives do we see greater provision and tension between God and ourselves than we do in the wilderness. A lot of us go through different forms of wilderness. Some of us have actually been in a real one. Some of us have actually just wandered off into the woods, just to see how it went. And then some of us are in spiritual wilderness, some of us are in social wilderness, some of us are in economic wilderness. We live in a country that really, you could say right now, America, as much as it's always been a very pointed and very well thought out nation, is in a state of wilderness, in a state of confusion, in a state of flux. And so you could say that we go through various kinds of wilderness in our life. We go through tests in the wilderness, we go through trials. I remember one time when I was deer hunting with my dad, we got separated. Still pretty sure my dad was just shadowing me the whole time laughing. But we got separated, if you don't want to bother. We got separated. I remember the first time in my life I felt like I was lost. And, it was a little scary. It was a little weird. And so, I did the smart thing when you're lost. You just keep walking. Wait a minute. You're supposed to... We're all rangers talking to sit still. Anyway, so I kept walking and then ultimately found a road, which sort of helped. But anyway, I remember that tension that I felt when I was lost and confused. And it's amazing how everything looks the same. When you get lost, you start to panic a little bit in your head, and you start to get a little bit confused, and all of a sudden every tree looks the same. Every stick is a bear. And every crackle in the background is a mountain lion. And suddenly nothing brings comfort. And so the wilderness can bring a lot of different tensions and provision. A lot of times we ignore the provision and we remember the tension, but there's provision in the wilderness. So let's take a look in the Bible, and we're going to take a look at really one of the first wilderness events the children of Israel go through. It says, "And it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones up from here with you. And it says, so they took their journey from Succoth and camped in Etham at the place of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud and led the way, and by night a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. So this is really one of the first kind of experiences that we begin to see that the children of Israel are going through. The Bible says that he could have taken them the way of civilization, the way of the Philistines, the way of people. He could have taken them the way of civilization. Over here is paved roads, for, as well as they paved them. Over here is an understood map. But I'm going to take them by way of the wilderness. And I'm going to take them by way of the wilderness for their own good. Because this fledgling nation, this tiny little nation, needs a chance and needs isolation and distance from turmoil in order to grow. It needs to be separated from these things that will cause distraction in the children of Israel. And so God says, listen, I can take them that way, but the reality is once the Philistines come with war, once the Philistines come with weaponry, once the Philistines come with organization, they might get scared and turn back. So I'm going to take them by way of the wilderness. Okay? That really is the reason that God gives for why he's going to take them by way of the wilderness. It's that simple. Because God says, listen, Philistines, they'll be a distraction. They have steel. They're ready to fight. They're angry. They won't like us coming through because you remember it's a group big of people. Lots of food is being consumed. Lots of the resources of the land being consumed. So I'm going to take them this way and keep them from distraction and fear. And the reality is that God knew that ultimately war would have to take place. There's going to be war that's going to have to take place once they get to their destination. They're going to have to go in and deal with the people that are there. They're going to have to do the things I asked them to do. Some really, really very, odd things, right? How many of you guys ever been a part of a Jericho March in church? Right? Oh man, come on, no Pentecostals. When you grow up, a little Jericho March, march around the church, right? We need God to do something, so we're going to march around this church 7 times. And praise and press the church and does what we're asking him to do. But, it wasn't always well thought out, Jericho marches. But there's this idea that I'm going to ask them to do things that are difficult, and so I need to make sure they are built up, they are ready to go, they have seen my provision, they have gone through the wilderness with me, therefore they will trust me. They will understand that I have their best interests in mind. They will understand that I have a knowledge of the future, and I know what's going on, so we will have this understanding. And so we can say this about the wilderness, though, is it's the place of God's provision, but the lack of trust would be the source of God's tension. See, God is saying, listen, I'm excited about what I can do for you out here, because I'm going to make sure we get to where we're going. I'm going to make sure I give you what you need. Okay, here's a giant cloud. Pretty cool, huh? Yep, giant pillar of fire. Everybody feels good so far. Right? Because at that point, you would think, if I'm being led by a giant cloud and a pillar of fire, God is obviously slightly bigger and stronger than I am. And he has way more power, way more control of the universe, so I trust him. So he gives them this guide. He never lets them be separated from leadership. He never lets them be separated from direction. He says, follow the cloud, follow the fire. And as long as the sun is up, there will be the cloud. As long as the sun is down, there will be the fire. And he says that I will give you this provision. But the reality is that throughout this series of events in the wilderness, the children of Israel continue to voice their lack of trust and their lack of faith. And that then is the source of God's tension. Is that he's saying, I don't know what more I have to do than what I've done and what I continue to do for you, but you continue to look for something other than what I'm providing. You continue to think that you have your own best interest in mind. So they begin this journey where God says, I'm going to take them by way of the wilderness around the Red Sea. Okay, and most of us know what's coming, right? All of us have read ahead. Yeah? This is really good. It's one of the cooler here. And so they're coming along, and then all of a sudden they run into what? The Red Sea. Right? The Red Sea. A small obstacle. But they run into it. And so they run into the Red Sea. And then the Bible says that Pharaoh comes up behind them, because Pharaoh's probably, he's kind of angry. All right? Been a lot of plagues. They left a mess. He's a little bit angry, wants his deposit back. So he's coming after them. And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid. The children of Israel cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, I love that, right? They cried out to the Lord. So they said to Moses, poor Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. It would be better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Okay, so they come through all of these things, and they run into their first wildernessy obstacle. A sea. Okay? So they run into the sea, the Red Sea, and they turn around and they see Pharaoh's behind them. I don't know what they were expecting exactly, but they turn around and they see Pharaoh's behind them. So naturally their first move is to go, God, why do you hate us? Right? Why do you hate us? You hate me. This Pharaoh's right there. You hate me. And so they complain. Then they go to Moses, because poor Moses happened to be available. They go to Moses. Seriously, just spend time on. They go to Moses. Because see, here you have a situation where the children of Israel are in a dangerous place. They're caught between their past and their future. And this is the thing that a lot of Christians go through in the wilderness, is when they enter it, we have this moment or two, or recurring, where we're caught between what's behind us and what's in front of us. And they turn around to look behind them. And they see Pharaoh. Now, had they just kept their eyes on the cloud and on the pillar, they would have never turned around to see Pharaoh. But instead, they took their eyes off what God was doing to give them direction to turn around to see what was going on behind them. And there's Pharaoh. Now, there's no reason to look back except to see if someone's following. Right? There's no reason to look back. But they did. And they see Pharaoh. And now all of a sudden, there's this fear that just sort of overwhelms them because Pharaoh is right on their tail. Pharaoh is coming to kill them. And so they cry out to God. They go, you brought us out here to die? I mean, that was your plan? There wasn't enough graves in Egypt? Which to me is really just basically swinging your spiritual hand and trying to give God a divine slap in the face, right?